My name is Maija Eriika Ruokanen, and I always like to introduce myself through filters. The idea of filters was introduced to me by Jennifer Abrams at one of the ECOS leadership conferences in Kuala Lumpur a few years ago. And the idea of filters is, what are the filters that I look at education through? Now, I was already introduced that I come from Finland. That is obviously my first filter. I went through schooling in Finland, and I was educated in the Finnish educational system. So that is my first filter. That is how I see the world, and I look at education. I graduated from high school. Actually, before I graduated from high school in Finland, I had a chance to live 1 year as an exchange student in Australia. And that obviously added to my filter of looking at my home country and looking at education in general. I studied at Oulu University. This is far up north in Finland. I come actually from the Arctic Circle in Finland. So this was 200 kilometers down from the south, from the Arctic Circle, so kind of like warmer climate for me. And I went to an international Master of Education program in Finland, and hence I kind of started becoming more international, I could say. I am elementary school teacher as a first trained, and you always see that whenever I talk anywhere, you can tell that I'm an elementary school teacher, and I'm proud of that. I always try to get the audience involved in all sorts of little kids' games. Now, I then started working in International School of Helsinki in Finland and in Oulu International School, and eventually I moved overseas, and I worked at United Nations International School in Hanoi, Vietnam, and then in United Nations International School in New York. So those obviously add to my filters. And then eventually, the longest I've worked in one place is actually in Bangkok, Thailand, and that's where I was the director of professional learning at NIST International School. Now, because I wasn't tied to a classroom, I actually had a chance to be part of the design team. We were renovating the whole entire school, step by step, actually, and I became part of that design process. And that's when I got really passionate about learning environments. I started learning more about it, I was studying about it, and then eventually I decided to take a year off and actually study interior design. And after I've studied interior design, I've actually started working as a consultant, working in different parts of the world about just talking with teachers about learning environments. I also work with a company called Fielding Nair International, which is a global school design company. We have studios all over the world, mainly in the States, and then we have a studio in Asia that kind of caters for Asia, Middle East, and Africa, and that's in Bangalore, India. So that's actually where I'm coming from today, from India here to Hong Kong. So those are all the filters that I look at education through. Now, I always start with the filters because I want you, and I'm hoping that at the same time, while you're listening to my filters, you're thinking of your filters. What are the things that are affecting how you look at education and how you look at the learning environment? I also always hope that you're kind of comparing, that you're looking at listening to my filters, thinking of your own filters, and comparing why are possibly we looking at things similarly or differently. So that gives more understanding where I'm coming from and where you're coming from when you're looking at those things. And actually, the main reason why I always start with the filters is because I want to give you time to get used to my accent. Finnish accent. People who know Finns know that this is the Finnish accent, but if you haven't heard Finns before, it always takes a little bit of time. So that's one of the reasons why we go for it. Okay, so this is actually the back wall of my workplace, Fielding Nair International, and in the middle you can see there is the word 21st century learning. Now, we hear about 21st century learning all the time. We hear that buzzword is being used a lot in education. What do we actually mean by it? What kind of things actually fall under so-called 21st century learning? Because I have a feeling it actually means lots of things for lots of different people. So we are going to do a little exercise. I want you to take out, if you have a notebook ready. If you don't have a notebook, have your phone, notes ready, or something ready where you can write. Because what I'm going to ask you to do is, I'm going to give you 1 minute, and I want you to list all the possible things that come to your mind when you're thinking of 21st century learning. Okay? So, it can be in any language. I don't mind at all if you're writing it in your language. It's for you to collect your thoughts. What do we actually mean when we talk about 21st century learning? So, we are going to be starting. I'm actually putting my timer on, and it starts now. Go! Do you actually hear it? My timer is on silent. Hard to hear. But that's the end. All right. 1 minute of what is 21st century learning. Now, is there anyone? No, actually, turn around to a person next to you. It could be 2, 3 people, whatever is natural, and kind of just share a little bit what you've got there. Just share your list and see how many commonalities you have between the people next to you. It's great to hear people talking. I can see that woke you up. Wonderful. I am sure you had quite many commonalities with your partner where you were sharing with. Does anyone want to share what they had down? Anyone want to call out? I know it's a big audience, so let's see if anyone's brave enough. Anything that come to your mind? Collaboration. Guess what? Everywhere people start with that. Fantastic, and that's what we are definitely going to be talking more about. Anyone else? Individualized learning. Anyone else? Sorry? Self-learning, personalized learning, yes. Well-being, that I don't hear often. Anything else? Oh, soft skills, fantastic. Ooh, technology, hey, we had some input from our youngest audience here too. Fantastic, thank you for sharing. I'm sure many of you had actually a lot of these things. This is by Angela Maija for World Economic Forum in 2015. And there are, of course, many different ways to present the 21st century skills. But I like this one, how she's divided it into 3 different groups. So we've got the foundational literacies there. We've got literacy, numeracy, and scientific literacy. All these things, there's the ICT, the technology that you mentioned. But no, there's also financial literacy and cultural and civic literacy. So a little bit of already tapping a bit further with the thinking. Then she's divided into competencies. There's the critical thinking, collaboration, the things that came up on your list also. And then finally, looking at character qualities. So there are things like curiosity, initiative, persistence and grit that has been talked a lot about. then adaptability, flexibility, but also leadership skills would be in the list. And then social and cultural awareness. So I really like this list, especially for the point of those character qualities that we are honing on when we are educating the future learners and the future people. So we need to think about, how are we going to be educating for these character qualities, for these competencies? What helps with that? One thing we know for sure, that the traditional type of learning, what we call in my company the cells and bells learning, is actually not going to help with those character qualities. If we are thinking of the environment, the learning environment as the third teacher, what you probably have heard that term before, how can these competencies and the character qualities be addressed in the learning environment? So, collaboration was mentioned. Many schools are addressing this with building that culture of collaboration. If we are thinking of learning environment, it often means the kind of environment where students can casually come together. So here in this first picture, most of my pictures are from Fielding Nair International, if I don't mention separately. There is usually a photo credit as well. But in this first picture, you can see the students coming together on those beanbags, casually discussing their learning. It looks like they have the control of their learning, and they are learning the way that suits their preferences. On the other picture, you can see there's a whiteboard wall and with a screen. And the idea of making learning visual, making it visible, so that other people who are in the same learning environment can actually know what's going on, who's learning what, and how to come together in that collaboration. The learning environment that allows for true collaboration, where students are really meeting each other and working out on their own projects and making sure that they are learning. You probably noticed that in this picture, in this learning environment, you don't see an adult around. You still see students learning. So they are driving their own learning. Here, you can see students coming together. It's an easy access to that collaboration, easily movable furniture that allows for that connection. Students working together, you can still see they have laptops with them, they are actually engaged in learning, but in a different kind of environment where they actually are the ones who are choosing how they do that. You can imagine that this would take a bit of that initiative, that would take a little bit of that leadership, those character qualities that we are wanting to build. So that leads to really that personalized type of learning, kind of differentiated, where students know what they want to learn and how they want to learn, and what works best for them. There is the curiosity, adaptability, and initiative being met in that kind of learning. In this picture, students are also outside, so creating those outdoor connections is always crucial. But if you look at this, you probably think, this is probably like a cafeteria after maybe a lunch break and so on. And if you look at it, you see those boys chatting there, it doesn't look like anything special as learning. But if you pay attention, you notice some people have brought their learning with them. So the idea of every space in a school being a learning space, allowing for learning in every possible place, and students feeling like they can do that everywhere. So that really is what self-directed learning is all about. That's what those character qualities can build up to be when students actually have agency of their own learning. They are active agents in their own learning, pursuing interests, pursuing their own passions. So if we think, if we are wanting to building that intrinsic motivation, an environment that allows students to explore and look into things that they are passionate about is really the key. So, learning environment that allows students to know what kind of learner they are and know what kind of learning suits them best. And then they make choices based on that knowledge. I actually use this picture as a kind of metaphor for the self-directed learning. You can see there are different types of seating available. Now, a student who gets easily distracted and needs a bit of their own kind of more structural space, they would choose to go and sit on those tables and sit properly on a proper chair and work on a table. They could possibly have a group around them. But those students who know that they can actually work and stay focused in a more casual setting, they would possibly choose the couches. Then there are those kids with some learning differences who are possibly having a little bit harder time focusing on the learning. They would possibly choose these round chairs that are actually kind of meant for those people who fidget and like to move, and that helps them actually focus. So the idea of self-direct learning is to become knowledgeable about how you learn and what works best for you. And learning environment can really help with that. So, with the culture of collaboration, we are aiming to build a learning community where students actually can come together and share their learning together and learn from each other as well. It doesn't always look the way we are used to looking. It might look a little bit different, and again, maybe a bit casual, and sometimes we feel that it might look a little bit out of control. But most of the time, when you actually talk to the students and ask about what they are doing, they actually know very well where they are at, what they are doing, and why they are doing the learning the way they do. But with that, you need to build the culture. You need to work on getting to know how you do things best. In the learning community, you might have the kind of learning environments that are not the usual spaces. This is actually a cafeteria, which is a bit more cafe-like. And the idea is that the students can actually take the learning there as well. So really the bottom line is that every space in a school is a learning space. There's no longer spaces, dead spaces like corridors that is not being used for learning. Now, when we are building a learning community, obviously, we are trying to be inclusive of all different types of learners that we have in our community. And allowing for all those learners come together and that every single learner has a place to learn their best possible way. Meeting different types of learning differences is easy when you have a learning community around where everyone belongs to. You might have heard about Reggio Emilia Pedagogy. Many of the international schools follow, especially in the early years, they follow the idea of Reggio, and the idea of the environment being as the third teacher is really coined with Reggio, and really looking at the learning environment. How do students feel in that learning environment? How do they see the learning environment from their point of view? How is the learning environment going to help them learn? What Reggio also talks about is about learning differences, and they don't talk about it as students with special needs. Reggio actually talks about students with special rights. And when we start thinking about every student having the rights to learn, we also look at the learning environment a little bit differently. So we can think about how can the learner inhabit the space, and what are some of the rights of every individual student, and how is the learning space meeting those rights. Now, Reggio also focuses a lot on documenting the learning and making it visual. And me, of course, coming from Finland, where our kind of official school only starts at 7, and until then our kindergarten is very play-based, the idea of exploring and testing theories and finding understandings about the real world really comes through play. But recognizing that that play actually leads to learning, and recognizing the kind of learning that is going on when you have that kind of environment. The kind of environment, this is from my previous school, NIST International School, the kind of environment that allows for curiosity and allows for that kind of exploration, experimentation. If we think of students and their rights and their maybe learning rights, the kind of environment that often works for students with special rights is really about natural materials, having like different tactile environment, having some natural colors that are not overpowering the senses, not too many sensory inputs, but also the natural tactile type, and then a lot of natural light. That often helps for students to focus, and they don't get as distracted with the fluorescent lighting. So, for any student, for any learner, the kind of space that promotes well-being, someone mentioned well-being in the 21st century skills, the kind of space that promotes well-being and kind of belonging. When spaces are no longer as much of an institutional spaces, that's when students feel like they belong there. It has that homey feel. It makes them feel safe. It makes them feel like the kind of space where they want to be. And that's, of course, is aim. If we want students to learn something, and especially we know that it's something challenging, if the environment makes them feel safe, they are far more keen to take those challenges and actually turn it into real learning. The learning actually happens because the mind is not occupied with feeling safe and worried about their security. Now, thinking about building a culture of collaboration, building a culture where self-directed learning thrives, building a learning community, and building the kind of environment where all learning rights are being met, and where learners feel comfortable and where they belong. That's a challenge when we are bound in those four walls that we most of the time have in our reality. There are some things we can kind of do That was there in the middle, just a little wake-up call for me. Maybe some of you have heard of these primordial learning metaphors. I have to say, that's a really weird term that has taken me many years to learn. But this was a theory by David D. Thornburg, already quite some time ago. The idea of campfires, watering holes, and caves. Now, Thornburg actually also introduced life, which is actually the learning in between. But we are going to talk a little bit about these three things, because often, if in a learning environment we aim to have these three components in there, we are actually catering for many of the learning needs in one space. So, when we talk about campfires, this here, it's the usual thing when we see a teacher surrounded by students, maybe sitting on the carpet, listening to the teacher giving instructions and so on. So we see a lot of campfires in classrooms when we go. We could consider it maybe in older student setting where they are sitting on their desks and the teacher is at the front. So that's kind of like the general classic campfire situation. Watering hole is more like when students come together, a bit more casually, and the watering holes can look like different, but basically it's the idea when animals can come and drink together. And often we think about in like office spaces, there is the water cooler where people meet and then they start chatting, and sometimes those most innovative ideas happen in that kind of casual environment. Now, cave is a space where a person can be alone, thinking, reflecting on their learning, and that's something that we could be incorporating in schools as well. So here is an example of a campfire. This is actually a whole school campfire where everyone's coming together. There is a space for the expert. It doesn't need to be always a teacher. But the campfire can be a space that can then turn into something else. Here you can see it's actually the steps leading to the next floor. So thinking of your school, thinking of your reality, where are there some places for that campfire that is necessary? Now, one thing about campfires is that we often have them in a classroom because it's that stage where the teacher is. But creating several campfires around a space so that there's multiple stages, so that the student actually knows that it's not always the teacher who's taking that stage, who is the expert in the campfire, but that it's actually there are several places where a student can share their learning in a campfire. That actually allows and really promotes the kind of sharing that we would like to see in the 21st century characteristics. Then, the watering hole. The watering holes are those spaces where students can come together and share their ideas. And often in a crammed classroom, that's hard to create because we have desks and chairs in the room. So thinking about how can we create the watering hole spaces where the ideas can actually bubble up and come, and when that exchange of ideas can happen. And it doesn't always mean that it's just between students. It could be with teacher, and teacher taking a little bit different type of role, being a more of a facilitator or mentor, helping with that thinking. Then, cave spaces. Now, in some schools, there are actually designs where there are spaces where students can kind of retire and retreat to think. You can see that tree house there, for example, that can be considered a learning space too, where students can do the thinking and meet there together. Now, cave doesn't always mean that you're there alone. You could be there with a group of people sharing the thinking. It could be also the kind of space that is one-to-one learning with a teacher. It's the space where you can kind of go away and ask for a teacher for extra questions or reflection and so on. When I go to different schools and when I run little design workshops with students, now that we are really in the middle of that culture of collaboration, students are asking more and more for these cave spaces because we are expecting them all the time collaborate and share and be active learners. That is actually tiring because it's a different way of learning just than being a passive listener. So asking for that, it means that we also need to give them a chance to take time off. Be in that space where you can actually do your own thinking and your own reflection. Now, if you don't have that kind of space where you are at, it's easy to create those spaces. In some places, people have just put like a few bookshelves together to create those little nooks and crannies where you can kind of go away for a little while. In one school, what we actually did was we actually put desks just next to the window and facing to outside. And what the students could do is basically sit there and look out and kind of block out all the things that were going behind them and have a chance to kind of connect with their own inner thinking. So there are different ways of creating the cave space, but the cave space, in order for us to make sure that the students are really tapping to their metacognition, creating those cave spaces is extremely important. So, going back a little bit what I've been saying and kind of summarizing, when we are trying to meet the rights of every learner, we want to make sure there are natural materials around and the colors are natural so that it doesn't take away the focus from the learning. We have multiple stages, but then making sure, especially with students with learning differences, having that stage very clear so that it's not cluttered with a lot of other information. So thinking also about displays and things like that. We teachers often like to make our environment really cozy and comfortable, and we have a lot of stuff around so that it looks that the learning is very active, right? Sometimes with students with learning diversities and differences are having a hard time knowing what to focus on. So always thinking, is my display active? Is it being actively used all the time? And if not, what's the real purpose for it being there? So not thinking of when we start an academic year, putting things up, but then making sure that over the year, things change according to the purpose of learning. So always focusing on the purpose of learning and making sure there's not too many sensory inputs. Then, thinking about seating. Here, we've got different type of learning going on, but if you're thinking of older students, if that's your reality, thinking of, do they actually have a choice in the seating? Is it always the same type of seat that they are having to sit all these days and hours and through? Kids spend a lot of time at school. Are they always sitting on a similar kind of seat? Do they have a choice in that? So looking at this, you can see different types of seating connected to the purpose of the activity and the kind of learning that is going on. So when we are designing the learning, thinking, what kind of learning environment would now help with that? Obviously, we don't always have the choice, but sometimes removing seating is also a choice, and having cushions and things like that in place. So, students feeling comfortable, students feeling like the space is for them is really the key. And I still want to repeat about those cave spaces and kind of spaces where students can feel that they are self-directing the learning. If we are asking for those skills of leadership and characteristics of curiosity and all of things, but if we are not changing the learning environment to allow for that, it's really hard to build that kind of culture in a school. Connections to outdoors. I know this is sometimes really hard to create in cities like Hong Kong. Many of the Asian cities are very big and built vertically, and you don't always have those connections. As often as you do, try to remember to use that, because that natural learning actually really gets students awake, active, focusing on, and of course fresh air is always a bonus too. So having those connections for outdoors, whenever there is a possibility, open it up, connect to that. And if there aren't, that is the reality very, very often, then thinking of how can you bring the outdoor in? Are there possibly plants that you can bring in? Flowers, things like that? Can the coloring of the school be connected to the nature, that it feels like you've brought in outdoors, even if you don't have real connections? So thinking of the color schemes, thinking of those things that can make you feel like you're surrounded by nature, surrounded by natural light, even when you actually don't have that in reality. Now, I'm hoping this last picture will actually link to the next speaker. Adam possibly is talking a little bit about how to connect the outdoors to the... So when you are thinking of your learning environment, really think of it. What is the learning like? And what you want the learning environment to bring as the third teacher into that equation.